Hey, Jessica.
Hey, Jessica.
All right, so we will get started, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, who is Jessica Leight, and she is a research fellow at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and she is going to present today on community-based strategies targeting intimate partner violence in developing countries, a growing research agenda. So we're really grateful to have Jessica take the time to join us and share some of this research. So take it away.
Thank you so much. So I hope you're seeing my slides now.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Maggie, for inviting me, and to everyone for joining. I'm really excited to share some about my work today. Please feel free to jump in with questions whenever you'd like, but there also should be plenty of time remaining for questions at the end. So the motivation for this presentation and the papers I'm going to discuss starts with the fact that we know intimate partner violence is a huge global health challenge. It's linked to adverse consequences for women who experience violence and for their families. And I should note from the beginning that the structure of the research I'll be discussing today is focused exclusively on the experience of violence by women at the hands of their male partners. So there are some dimensions of violence in same-sex partnerships or experienced by men that we're clearly not capturing. But I think it's fair to say in the context in which I'm working, this is clearly the dominant form of intimate partner violence. So the high prevalence of IPV in many developing countries reflects broadly entrenched inequitable gender norms. And those norms are also manifest in gender disparities and other outcomes, for example, elevated HIV risk. And identifying appropriate strategies to target the root causes of IPV at a community level and prevent violence is an extremely important goal. And it's also the main policy lever that is typically available to target IPV in sub-Saharan Africa. So in rich country settings, we often think of the response to violence as kind of one that's rooted in the criminal justice system, identifying perpetrators, punishing them, but that infrastructure largely doesn't exist. So we're thinking about violence as kind of a community, a systemic challenge that can be addressed before it happens, rather than targeting perpetrators after violence has occurred. So to be more specific, there's a lot of interest in recent years in community level and group-based interventions to prevent IPV that seek to, in various ways, target underlying gender norms. And the empirical literature here has exploded in recent years. So of course, I'll talk more about kind of the particular intervention I'm interested in, but what do I broadly mean by this type of intervention? Educational sessions, community campaigns, discussion groups, including women, adding IPV programming to existing peer groups or existing savings groups. Those are the types of interventions that I'm kind of thinking of. And I'm going to describe one large-scale trial that I co-led that sought to evaluate the effectiveness of a group-based IPV prevention intervention that was delivered in kind of different models to men, women, or couples in rural Ethiopia. And I'll also describe some papers that sought to analyze innovations around the measurement of IPV using data from the same trial. So those papers are more descriptive, but seek to kind of broaden our understanding of how to measure intimate partner violence. And then I'll conclude by describing a more recent meta-analysis that isn't published yet, that I've been working on with some other IPV researchers that seeks to synthesize findings within this literature. So including this trial and a large number of others that have all been conducted in roughly the same period, and the overwhelming number of them also in sub-Saharan Africa. So let me start with the main trial I'll be talking about, and the one that I know best. So we were evaluating a program that we called Unite for a Better Life. And we describe it as a participatory, gender transformative IPV and HIV prevention intervention. And as I noted, it was delivered to groups of women, men, or couples. And it was delivered in the context of the Ethiopian coffee ceremony, which is kind of a traditional forum for discussions in Ethiopia, both more informal, coffee ceremony with your friends or your neighbors, and also for somewhat more formal or larger group discussions. Coffee is prepared and served along with little refreshments, and kind of done so in a culturally prescribed way that kind of everyone would be familiar with. And what we did for UBL was to essentially hold a coffee ceremony and use that to also have a facilitated discussion about topics linked to intimate partner violence and gender norms. And I'll elaborate more about that in a moment. And this whole project was jointly led with Vandana Sharma, who's actually at HSPH and now in the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. She was previously at GPAL, and Ngusi Diesa, who's at the Addis Ababa University School of Public Health. So we launched the trial, including a sample of 64 villages in 4 districts in southern Ethiopia. And we had 4 arms. The same fundamental program that I'm about to describe more, UBL delivered to men, women, or couples, and then 16 villages in the control arm. So our sample overall included about 7,000 respondents. These were cohabiting couples only and randomly selected within the study villages. Now in rural Ethiopia, it's rare to find adults living alone unless they are widowed. Divorce is relatively unusual, but we weren't including youth, for example, or any individual who happened to be widowed or separated. When we started the trial at the baseline survey, we surveyed only one spouse, though at endline we surveyed both spouses, and that will kind of become important in measurement. We had kind of relatively low attrition. And our primary focus was in targeting experience of IPV over the past year, both reported by women and reported perpetration by men. And we were also interested in HIV risk behaviors and comprehensive knowledge around HIV and the condom use at last intercourse. So this just gives you a sense of the design. It's a relatively complex diagram, but actually I think most of what's on it I've already stated. So we had 4 arms. We had a further random assignment at baseline to the survey subarm, determining whether we surveyed the woman or the man. And we also, within the communities where we were going to roll out UBL, had a further level of randomization around the invitation. It's captured kind of in the center here. So around 25% of households were actually not sampled for the intervention, and the remainder were sampled, as in they were invited to participate. So to describe UBL more, we worked with Engender Health to develop the curriculum, and then we worked with our Ethiopian co-PI and a number of other Ethiopian staff with expertise in gender programming to pilot test and refine the curricula prior to the trial. So the final structure was 14 sessions, so the total was about 38 hours. Each one was about 2 hours, and the sessions were twice weekly, so the cycle would finish in 7 weeks. We had one same gender facilitator for the men's and women's groups. And for the couples groups, there was a female and male facilitator working jointly. And the goal was to kind of identifying and transform power imbalances within relationships and build skills in healthy and nonviolent, equitable relationships. And there was also a substantial focus on kind of healthy sexuality and sexual communication as a component of relationship quality, as well as safe sex and reduction of HIV risk behaviors. I should note that the curricula were fundamentally similar in structure. So the outline of the sessions was parallel across all 3 arms, but there were kind of different emphases, of course, in the curricula, depending on who was participating. So the male curricula has more of a focus on kind of unpacking concepts of masculinity. What does it mean to be a good husband, a good father? How does kind of the use of violence play into people's perceptions about masculine identity? The female curricula was more focused on kind of collective support, supporting other women who are experiencing violence, what can be done for those women to address violence in their relationships, or seek help, though exiting a relationship would be a very rare outcome in this context. And then the couples curricula had more of a focus on kind of modeling and practicing communication, conflict resolution, etc. Part of the purpose of having a female and a male facilitator side by side was also to facilitate some breakout sessions where the men and women would do some exercises kind of separately side by side, and then reintegrate in the mixed gender group. And then just noting again, the coffee ceremony, one particular reason we thought to draw on the coffee ceremony is that it provided a very direct opportunity to talk about gender equity in the context of who prepares coffee. So traditionally, only women prepare coffee. And men, even if it's only a group of men who are participating in the ceremony, they would have a nearby woman or a servant or a young girl make the coffee and serve it to them. So here, this was an opportunity to promote a more equitable behavior, starting with the facilitators. They would prepare, the male facilitators would prepare the coffee, and then each participant, including the men, would take it in turn. And this kind of increased interest and hopefully was well received. We had some qualitative data collection. I won't be talking about that today. And this was often mentioned by the male participants, that they really learned to make coffee, and their coffee was so good, and their wives or their friends couldn't even believe how good their coffee was, and it was better than their wives, etc. So there was kind of a lot of interest in that dimension. And we did find that attendance was relatively high. So we had about 80% of the sampled respondents kind of received an invitation, complete at least 70% of the sessions. And just to give you a sense of our sample, so we were working in the Budajira region of Ethiopia. It's about 200 kilometers south of Addis Ababa. These were all cohabiting couples. They had an intermediate age range, 32 to 37. It's not on the slide, but I believe 75 or 80% of them do have children. It's a very low level of education. So 3/4 of women have never attended school. Polygamy is not extremely common, but it is present. 16% of women reported being in a polygamous relationship, and slightly under 2/3 of the households are Muslim, the remainder being Orthodox Christian. For the polygamous households, we only had, if they were in the couple's arm, only 2 people could attend. So it was up to the household to decide which wife would accompany the husband. So the analysis is quite simple, kind of given the randomized structure, so I won't dwell a lot on technical details. Since we also had a second level of randomization, we were also able to assess spillovers, right? So we have this subsample that was randomly selected not to be invited to the program, but kind of living in a village where many were, and I'll come back to that. But I'll start with the findings for those in treated villages who were actually invited to participate compared to those in control villages. And the primary follow-up is about 24 months post-treatment. For IPV-related interventions, that's fairly typical. So 1 to 2 years is probably the modal follow-up period. So here, I'll start just kind of, if we look at the summary statistics, you can see in the left columns, in the first panel, it's data from the female surveys, and the second panel, data from the male surveys. And the rates aren't that different. So both men and women report about a 20% incidence of past year physical IPV, and a higher, in the case of women, 30 to 40% prevalence of past year sexual IPV. So this is kind of a very high violence context in general that's consistent with other surveys conducted in Ethiopia. Jessica?
Hey, sorry if you said this already. How did you guys define IPV for in this table? How is it defined?
So it's any incidence of an enumerated type of violence. So we followed the WHO multi-country study instrument. So past year physical IPV is slapping, hitting, kicking, etc. There's kind of 1 or 2 more. And then sexual IPV is being forced to engage in sexual intercourse or other sexual acts kind of against your will. Okay. But only from the intimate partner, only for cohabiting couples. So those who, for some reason, were not cohabiting at inline are not included in this analysis, but that's a small share.
Thanks.
So then, bearing in mind these relatively high rates of violence, we then report kind of the treatment effects for the intervention, couples, women, and men. And if you look kind of to the right, you can see that here the only significant reductions in IPV we observe are in the men's arm. They're for sexual IPV and more precisely estimated in the male reports. Again, these are reports of men stating that they perpetrated IPV as opposed to women stating they experienced it. The magnitudes aren't that different, so it's about 20 to 25% reduction in past year sexual IPV, but it's only significant when reported by men. We don't see any shift in physical IPV. I think there's a lot of reasons given that the kind of structure of the curriculum and the disproportionate focus relative to other interventions on questions around kind of sexual communication, consent, etc. There's a lot of reasons that we aren't surprised that we see the effect usually on primarily on sexual IPV, but it is different. It's, I think, more common to see the first response in physical IPV. And we don't see any shift in the couples or women's arms at all. So there's no evidence that delivering the intervention to groups of couples or to women shifted IPV here. So for other outcomes, I'm sorry, then the title here is somewhat incomplete. I couldn't fit kind of more on the green, but the first two rows here are actually primary from the perspective of the trial. The others are secondary, so just to keep that in mind. So when we look at variables related to kind of HIV knowledge and actual sexual behavior, so condom use, bear in mind, these are all cohabiting couples. So this, I mean, of course, they could have had intercourse with someone else. We also asked about that. It's extremely rare. So this is essentially condom use within a marriage. Here we see quite large effects that seem to be more concentrated in the couples and women's arm, particularly in the couples arm. And then when we look at variables linked to knowledge, attitudes, norms, so knowledge of IPV laws, is, IPV is illegal, in fact, in Ethiopia, support for gender equitable norms, belief that IPV is not justified, kind of a heterogeneous picture. There's not kind of very strong evidence, but some evidence, particularly in the women's arm, that there's some shift towards gender equitable norms. And then the final panel captures kind of household decision-making and division of household tasks. So are men involved in household and childcare tasks, and are men dominant in decision making? And you can see that there are some fairly large effects in male involvement only in the couple's arm, kind of as reported by women. But there will be some kind of meaningful heterogeneity when we look at the same questions reported by men, which is on the next slide. So here are all the variables are parallel, but this is reported by men. Again, for the first two panels, I think the story isn't that different. We're seeing some effect on reported condom use, particularly in the couples arm. Those effects are very large, but they're noisily estimated. We see some effects on social norms, but they're kind of not very precise. But we see very large effects here on men reporting their own level of male involvement and on male dominance in decision making. And they're actually more or less parallel across all three arms, though smaller in the women's arm. So from men's perspective, they've experienced kind of a substantial shift towards equity in household tasks and a substantial reduction in decision-making around kind of important questions. We have some other decision-making variables, but for concision, I didn't include them here. They are in the paper. And we see similar effects as reported by women, but they don't seem to be as large from women's perspective. So we also looked at some ancillary outcomes in a second paper. So we examined some depressive symptoms for women. So given that not all women experienced the reduction in IPV, of course, it was only in one arm, but given these general shifts within the household, did that affect women's mental health outcomes? We found that there was no effect. And we also looked at substance use patterns from men. So the men's curricula in particular had a substantial emphasis on the role of alcohol and khat use as laying the foundation for violence, facilitating violence. And we saw some minor effects on substance use, actually a substitution from alcohol to khat. I think the welfare implications of that are a little bit unclear, but those effects were relatively small. So those additional margins didn't seem to be very crucial. And then we also did an analysis of spillover effects where we looked at the sample of individuals in treated communities who weren't invited to participate and kind of, again, estimate the effects vis-a-vis the control. And we found that those effects were actually generally of comparable magnitude. So they're a bit noisy because that was only a 25% sample. Our spillover sample isn't very large. But we can't reject the hypothesis that the effect for the spillover households was the same as for those who were directly invited to participate. And then we also conducted a cost effectiveness analysis that suggested, kind of particularly given spillovers, the intervention was quite effective in terms of cost per case of IPV averted. This wasn't a particularly expensive program, so the facilitators were all recruited locally. They kind of, the modal facilitator might be someone who had experience as a teacher or had a teaching degree or had some kind of low-level experience related to the health system, but they were not trained therapists or social workers or anything like that. So their salaries were relatively low. The main cost, of course, is recruiting and training the facilitators and deploying them, as well as the supplies needed for the coffee ceremony itself. So we found an estimated cost of about $200 per case of past year IPV averted. So there are only 2 other trials that had comparable estimates published. One is from the Images trial in South Africa and one from SASA in Uganda. So our estimate is about 50 to 70% lower than those estimates, which we find encouraging, but of course it's important to caveat this isn't a large body of evidence yet. And there's a lot more to be learned about relative cost effectiveness of these interventions. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about some of our measurement papers, and then I can move on to the meta-analysis. So given the scope of data collection, we also attempted to incorporate some measurement innovations. So we included retrospective questions for respondents to report their exposure to intimate partner violence in their natal home, kind of among their parents. And there are a lot of reasons to think that there could be challenges in recall, time lapse, social desirability bias, etc. But we were interested to explore the quality of that data. And then also at Nline, we surveyed both men and women about their perpetration of an experience of IPV. And this is relatively unusual. So we're not the first to do it. There are a number of other papers about kind of matched reports of IPV, but it can have ethical implications, kind of depending on the context, and has to be. So we had a lot of discussions with our Ethiopian collaborators about the appropriateness of this, since they kind of concluded that we felt that the risks were minimal. We did have these matched reports, and then we can say something about discordance and discordant reporting. So kind of using this data, what are kind of the 2 other empirical patterns that we saw? So from a longitudinal perspective, we looked at the cross-generational correlation between the experience of IPV in the natal home, meaning kind of violence from one's father to one's mother, not kind of violence against children, and reports of intimate partner violence in your current marital home. And we actually found that correlation was essentially null, which is surprising because there's lots of reasons to think that just reporting bias would lead to kind of a spurious correlation. You might be likely, you don't really remember exactly what kind of your parents were doing, or you're self-conscious about it. You might just default to reporting that your kind of natal home life was similar to your marital home life, and that would tend to generate the correlation. We actually found the correlation was almost 0. And similarly, when we look at the relationship between a natal home IPV and other variables linked to decision-making in the marital home. So it doesn't seem like there's a very strong transmission mechanism across generations and gender norms here. And that could be consistent. We can't directly substantiate this, but that could be consistent with the hypothesis that kind of gender norms are changing so rapidly in Ethiopia that kind of that transmission link has been broken. It's worth noting there are some other papers, not many, but some particularly in South Asia and in China that have looked at this type of cross-generational correlation of norms and found the correlation to be significant, though often that's for a younger sample, so adolescents or youth and their parents, whereas we're looking at adults. And then, as I noted, we found that there's significant discordance between men and women reporting IPV. So when I showed the results, I kind of pointed out that in general, the prevalence rates on average weren't that different, though women seem somewhat more likely to report experience of sexual IPV. But that's just at the sample level. When we look at the household level and we directly match, there's a lot of discordance in both directions. So women reporting they experienced IPV while their spouses report they did not perpetrate it, and vice versa. And so if you incorporate both reports and construct a household level measure of equal to 1 if either partner reports an incidence of IPV, that has a big effect on the reported prevalence. So just for physical IPV, for example, that would increase the prevalence from 21 to 37%. So it would almost double. That's not to suggest that this is necessarily a preferable or a better method of measuring IPV. That's a big question. It's of course also much more resource intensive to collect data from both partners, but clearly would lead to a very different conclusion. We then look at some associational evidence, just what are the characteristics of households where we have these discordant reporting patterns. And that's not a causal, so we have to be kind of cautious. But we did see that for both men and women, when that particular individual has more gender equitable attitudes in general, they seem to be more likely to refrain from reporting that perpetration or experience of IPV while their spouse reports the opposite. That's particularly prominent for men. So that would be suggestive of kind of a role of shame. So I'm stating that I'm, have gender equitable attitudes, and perhaps that's the truth. And so I'm unwilling to admit that I've also actually perpetrated intimate partner violence, even though my spouse will report that I did. But it's also evident in the opposite direction. So even women who state that they have more gender equitable attitudes seem to be less likely to report that, yes, I've experienced violence, when their husbands report, yes, I did perpetrate. In general, I think our conclusion is that there's a lot more to be understood about how and when men report IPV and how that data can be incorporated into kind of program evaluations and research in this area. There's still, I think, kind of this general intuition, and that can be correct in some contexts, that men would always underreport IPV. And so, may not even be worthwhile asking questions about perpetration because men just wouldn't report that they had perpetrated violence. But that's, generally not what we see. Okay, so I'll just take the last few minutes to kind of talk about a new project that I've been working on with a different set of co-authors. So over the years in which we conducted this trial, which is kind of roughly 2014 to 2018 for the intervention and core data collection, there were a large number of other interventions with similar features that were rolled out, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and a number of high quality evaluations conducted. So I then worked with 3 co-authors to do a meta-analysis of these findings and to synthesize evidence. And this paper isn't published, so these findings are more preliminary. But just to give you a sense of kind of the scope of the research base here. So we have quite narrow criteria. So only randomized controlled trials, only conducted in low and middle income countries. And we focus on interventions with the following characteristics. They have IPV prevention as one of the goals. They're community level or group based, meaning something like a one-on-one therapeutic intervention, like offering couples counseling to a single couple would not be included. They're not primarily economic. Some of the interventions have some economic components, but cash transfers would kind of not qualify here. And we also exclude trials that have a more specific target group. So those that primarily target adolescents, so women under 18, we don't include. Women, those that target sex workers, which is actually a fairly large literature in and of itself, we similarly exclude. And trials that might seek to provide interventions to women who are already identified as experiencing intimate partner violence, we similarly don't include. So broadly, we're looking for trials that are defined kind of a broad population of community members who could be experiencing IPV or engaging in IPV or could be at risk of it, but not these kind of more specific target groups. That being said, even so, we have 30 trials. Most of them are very recent. So 20 of the 30 were published in 2018 or later, and 26 of the 30 are from sub-Saharan Africa. So it's kind of a very geographically focused evidence base. Of course, we're not including trials from rich countries, but even within the developing world, the evidence base is clearly from sub-Saharan Africa. And even within that region, as I recall, about 10 are from South Africa. So there's a very pronounced, even sub-regional concentration. So in the analysis, it's a relatively straightforward random effects meta-analysis, kind of 2 innovations is perhaps too strong a word, but two kind of notable features. The first is that we estimate a multilingual model where we include kind of all estimated effects within the trial. So both primary and secondary outcomes and as reported across multiple arms. And the potential advantage of this is that many trials, such as the one that I just presented, collect data on a relatively large number of intimate partner violence outcomes. That's kind of a convention, as it were. We also collected data. I didn't show it on emotional IPV. Many studies collect data on economic IPV. So those four, at least, are kind of commonly observed in addition to variables capturing perpetration. So we wanted to kind of benefit from this abundance of data and kind of account for the dependence across those estimated effects. And then we also estimated meta-regression. And here we're focusing on the type of intervention and the type of target population. So of course, we don't have sufficient sample to be very specific. For interventions, we're looking at interventions that are truly community-based, so like a community campaign, or group-based, groups of women, men, or couples. That would be the type of intervention that UBL provides. And the target population could be youth. As you recall, we excluded trials that were focusing on adolescents, but youth with a more expansive definition of 18 to 30, cohabiting couples, or unrestricted. So I'll just show a couple of high-level findings. So here are the forest plots. So on the left are the meta-analysis using unadjusted effects, and on the right using adjusted effects when presented. There's a difference in kind of the composition of studies because some present only adjusted or only unadjusted. We didn't seek to impose our own adjustments, but as you see, the results are kind of very consistent. So we see that in general, we observe a pooled effect of around a 25% reduction of IPV. So pooling across all of these estimates of community level and group level interventions, they do seem to be effective. It's a fairly large coefficient. There's a huge amount of heterogeneity, so it may be a bit small to read, but the I-squared is kind of between 70 to 80%. So there's a lot of unexplained heterogeneity across studies. That's just evident visually. You can see some showing kind of the largest effects can be showing kind of 75 to 80% reductions in violence. And there are some, of course, that are close to zero or slightly to the right of it. And the only other thing I'll note, again, kind of related to the multi-level analysis, you can see for each study, the black and then the gray confidence interval, and the black confidence interval captures the additional precision gained by aggregating multiple estimates across trials. And in some cases, for example, the second trial on the right, so Abramsky, there's a lot of gain in precision. So that trial reported 3 coefficient estimates linked to IPV outcomes. And when aggregating across those, the estimated treatment effect becomes much more precise. But there's also many examples where the gains are relatively small. But that's what the graph allows us to capture. And then the meta-regression, this is for the adjusted estimates, but again, the results are very consistent. So by and large here, we don't see any significant difference. So as you recall, there's a large amount of heterogeneity across trials, but it doesn't seem that these particular characteristics of the target population or the intervention type are predictive of that variation. The one exception almost is youth. So there were 5 trials focusing on youth, and there's a greater reduction in IPV on those trials, but it's actually marginally significant, kind of only the 10% level. But the coefficient is large, so estimates were 40% larger for youth trials. I think that's weak evidence, but that's kind of the only characteristic that seems at all predictive of the variation and effects across the sample. So I think I've kind of largely captured these points already, but in general, we conclude that it does seem that these interventions are promising, but there's a very wide level of heterogeneity that doesn't seem to be captured by the most obvious features of the intervention and target population. So there's a lot more to be understood here about what intervention modalities are most effective and in what context. Okay, so let me stop there. And I'm happy to have comments, questions, any discussion.
Terrific. So folks, you can raise your virtual hands with comments and questions, and while you give people a chance to reflect, I'll sort of just jump in. I mean, thanks so much for presenting. It's really terrific to see this kind of body of work and different, like the meta-analysis combined with the trials is and the measurement stuff. So thanks for taking the time to present, you know, such a comprehensive overview on what's happening. So that's terrific. I guess I'm curious, I know you said a little bit about this, but maybe you can say more, you know, about the coffee chats and the kinds of things that were covered and how much, you know, heterogeneity there was in the like those kinds of things can be hard to, you know, control and even understand. Like all, you know, there's so many different kinds of content being covered. Like how you know, is there a way to like measure how much of it, you know, directly sort of addressed issues of violence versus like those indirect contributors? Yeah, so I'm just curious, like whether you have a qualitative sense or any sort of data on that kind of you know, content when it's such a kind of diverse intervention.
Sure. So in terms of our trial, I would say it was probably about a third of the time and sessions focusing on kind of general questions of gender norms, like what does it mean to act like a man, act like a woman, what role do men and women play, you know, how do they benefit from this, how are they hurt by conforming to these norms, etc. And then about a third focusing kind of more explicitly on questions of violence. So you know, how does happen, what are the triggers, what are the consequences for the couple, for children, for society. There was some discussion about kind of what's the law around violence in Ethiopia, what are resources available around violence. And then about a third was more kind of sexuality focused. And that was partly, again, about kind of like open communication, what are the expectations around men and women when it comes to sex, and then some kind of more narrow topics about you know, risk-taking and kind of reducing risk-taking behaviors. I didn't have much time to kind of talk about the HIV angle. That was kind of a particular priority of one of our funders, but Ethiopia is not a high HIV prevalence context. So we just kind of focused on these questions of kind of sexual and reproductive health. So by heterogeneity, do you mean heterogeneity across different programs in terms of the mix of?
I even meant sort of within the program, like, you know, in this kind of free form discussion, even if there's a curriculum, it seems like you could have, okay, there's an interest in this group and talking more here, or there might actually be kind of like a fair amount of variation in practice.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we have some kind of, we have some brief follow-up questionnaires, even too kind of word, like 3 or 4 questions posed to respondents at the end of each session that was more focused on just comprehension. We didn't do any kind of recording or like textual analysis of sessions. We did, in general, feel like these sessions were quite tightly structured. So the intention wasn't for the facilitator to have a lot of discretion, though, of course, he or she could. And when we did our qualitative work, we kind of, the key points that people recalled or that they were eager to discuss, or the coffee was a big one. So as I mentioned, kind of preparing coffee and how novel that was. And there was a lot of discussion, yes, about kind of the consequences of violence. And also a lot of people kind of commented or recalled the focus on kind of sexual communication. Those did seem to be like the 3 points that came to the most. But in terms of whether there were systematic differences in one group as opposed to another, as to kind of what exactly they discussed, it would be hard for us to capture.
Right. Super interesting. Okay, so I see Kevin and then Aisha. So why don't we go with Kevin and pass it to Aisha?
Thanks so much. It's a really interesting set of papers, really interesting presentation. I was just struck by the forest plots, how if I was reading the grayer, the broader bars there, it seemed like a lot of the trials looked like nulls, but then the meta-analysis showed, you know, a combined very large effect. And I mean, do you interpret that as like everybody's underpowering their trials in this space, or and you mentioned they're so recent, like is it that the people have really optimistic impressions of what the effect sizes would be, or like what's going on there with the discords?
That's a good point. I do think that power is a challenge, and this may be something we could explore more systematically in the meta-analysis, which we haven't. This is just my observation. Our study was one of the very largest, and still, as you saw, we were kind of a lot of our effects are kind of on the margin of significance. Achieving a reduction in IPV of more than 20% is not that easy to do, but I think a lot of the trials are a little bit on the small side, particularly in terms of the number of clusters. And seeing trials with, well, some of them have as few as 8, but probably the modal trials maybe in like the 30 to 50 cluster range. Almost all of these interventions, not all, but almost all, given their nature, are kind of randomized at the cluster level. So I think there is a power challenge. It's also the case that there are a few trials with just very large reductions, and that's kind of partly driving the pooled effect. So we haven't experimented with removing outliers, and that might be a useful thing to do.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Aisha.
It's really great to see these findings in the broader context. I want to just go back to the measurement issue, because I wanted to know whether, given how challenging it can be to capture IPV, whether anyone in the field or whether in your group you've looked at the influence or the effect of who the field worker is, who is collecting that data and their gender, in terms of the response that you're receiving from either men or women.
Yeah, good question. So in this trial, all of the women were surveyed by female enumerators, and all of the men were surveyed by male enumerators. But I have worked on another recent survey also in Ethiopia, where we did have mixed gender enumerators, and there was an effect. So women were less likely to report IPV to a male enumerator. The effect size is about 4 percentage points. I wouldn't say that's huge, but it depends on your prior. It was biggest for sexual violence, which again I think is intuitive, right? Now may be particularly sensitive to report to men. And we have also, we also experimented with a list. We did a list experiment as part of this trial, which I didn't even discuss. It didn't work. So the prevalence estimates from the list experiment are very close to 0, even negative, which essentially suggests that people aren't understanding the list well. And I've actually had that experience twice, which made me very skeptical about running list experiments in kind of developing countries. And then there's another, I have nothing to do with this, but I'll just mention it. There's another very recent paper that was looking at computer-assisted methods of surveying around IPV. So some earlier papers had suggested that was promising, but this analysis in Liberia suggested that was also generating bias in the opposite direction, because essentially women working with these tablets where you click yes or no, they're just randomizing. And so that's just pushing the estimate of IPV towards 50% when it would probably be lower. So measurement is a really important question, but most of the, my subjective view is that most of the promising innovations actually haven't worked out. So kind of the best strategy that we have right now still seems to be these direct questions, and as you say, administered in kind of the best possible conditions in terms of well-trained enumerators who can pose the question sensitively and treat the information confidentially.
Thanks.
Super interesting. So just like a quick follow-up, and then of course, if there are other questions, please raise your hand, or you can jump in after me. Yeah, I think that the measurement stuff, that's a super interesting summary of the existing evidence and really useful. I had the same kind of questions about measurement. Obviously, there's a trial where there's a lot of talking and sensitization about, gender violence and what sort of is, kind of run-of-the-mill partner communication, and what is like more, how do you even define, what constitutes violence, especially around the questions of the mismatches in reporting that you're observing, which are super fascinating. You sort of gave one theory for why those might be happening, and sort of, more in the sort of couples who are having, reporting values of gender equity. I think, I wonder if there's like another possibility where there's like a cognitive dissonance there of, I have some gender equity as like an important value, therefore I even interactions that others might see as violent, I don't see that, I sort of don't code them that way because of the sort of cognitive dissonance that would cause with like the values that I know me or my spouse hold, which, and so part of, I guess, my question, and maybe you said this and I missed it, but you're asking about how these kinds of incidents happened to you. Do you ask like sort of more general questions about like how you define violence, or what, even like situational or vignette kinds of things that would have people assess sort of interactions that don't involve themselves to sort of see if people's understanding or coding of what is violence changes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that would be a neat thing to do. We didn't do that. So we didn't do that in the survey. So in the survey, we have our kind of straightforward questions because, you know, your partner hit you, etc. And we had the list experiment. And then we had a whole series of questions about IPV norms. They were exercises like that in the facilitated sessions, actually,
Right.
kind of vignettes where different situations were described and as a prompt to discuss what the violence is. That would also be an interesting measurement technique, but we didn't pursue that in the survey.
I was also kind of like stuck on the discordance between the partners' reports and sort of the existential question about like what that means about I don't even know exactly how to frame the question. Like it's almost like it's not a measurement issue, but rather like that in some ways, like the intervention, like, does it suggest that the intervention should target like a more common understanding of what violence is within the household? Or yeah, like I wonder if you like reflect on like what the intervention should be like based on the fact that we don't even have the same understanding of, because differences that large, like, you know, those weren't like tiny differences in reporting, suggest it's not like forgetting, like, you know, someone forgets more, or like we have like somewhat different understanding of what consent means, but like we have a really fundamentally different, either there's like almost no signal in the way the question's asked, like it's just people are just answering totally at random, which I doubt is true, or we have like really completely different concepts of like what we mean by violence, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So starting with a shared definition of violence is important, and that was, I mean, I would say there was probably at least like one session that focused solely on that,
Right.
but you know, maybe there's the need for a lot more probing on that. I also think the question of, well, this is kind of our speculation, we don't have any direct evidence of this, but the question of violence intensity may be really important. So the question is about like, did this ever happen in the past year? And then we have some follow-up questions, like many surveys, about kind of whether it was frequent or infrequent or so on. But I wonder if there are just kind of very different thresholds at play for men and women, or maybe not systematically for men and women, but just at the individual level, like people are thinking about this very differently. So maybe if my husband slapped me once, like, yeah, as you said, I haven't forgotten, but it's like not worth mentioning. But you know, for others, there may be sort of some tipping points that we don't observe. And there is actually a joint effort that I'm not a part of, but London is a part of, to kind of compile data on varying severity or intensity of violence, again, across multiple trials, including ours, to understand more about whether kind of there are measurement gains there. I don't know if they're going to look specifically at the discordance issue, but I wonder if that is kind of an underlying factor, discordance, that that people are just dichotomizing their experience in very different ways, and that if we had a more continuous measure, you know, the match might not be quite so stark. But that's just I
had also one other question and a suggestion, although I don't know if this has been done already. The suggestion is that I don't, you know, this is like, I don't know very much at all about this topic, so I'm learning a lot from listening to you, but I don't know how well it's measured in the sort of usual suspects, like large household surveys like DHS and those kind of surveys, but there are files now available that give you a lot of information on who the surveyor was, like the gender of the surveyor and like all kinds of other information. So if you want to get more at Aisha's question about how the characteristics of the interviewer influence responses, I think those interviewer files probably have a lot of cool potential.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. So generally the DHS data on IPV, which is not collected in every country, but in many, is considered to be very high quality.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a really good idea. I mean, part of the challenge in any particular survey, we don't have like a huge amount of variation in our enumerator characteristics, or we don't, and sometimes we don't even measure it very, very well. But if that's available on a large scale, that could be a really neat.
Yeah, I don't know exactly which variables are available. Maybe someone else in the Zoom room knows, but like what else is available besides the gender of the enumerators. But I think there are other I think there's some other information about it too. I guess my other question was whether you have any reflections on like whether the targeting of the interventions to the trial should be, like whether you have any reflections on like how you would change the invitations into the trial and who you targeted more based on like what you've learned through all this various work.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it certainly seems to suggest that a focus on either, well, on youth or perhaps just on the recently married, which can overlap with youth but not exclusive, would be optimal. And there's a lot of reasons I think that makes sense, right? Like relationships fall into patterns and they're very hard to change. And we had some qualitative data, in fact, from couples who had been married for a long time, kind of older couples who described exactly this, that they were kind of open to some of the lessons from the intervention and they kind of tried to change. There was some change, but kind of incomplete. So it was kind of very, very difficult for them to undo entrenched patterns. So that would be one area of focus. Otherwise, we haven't done much to explore whether there are kind of like individual level predictors of for whom the intervention would be more valuable. And I wouldn't say other trials have done that much either from what I've seen. So I think that that's largely an unanswered question.
Terrific, super great discussion. Are there any other comments, questions from people on the talk? Give people space to say, Jan, I saw you maybe have a question. No, I also, so we can wrap up since I know people transition from one thing to the next. I had the same question as Jessica about like who is attending, because obviously, you know, like sort of the selection of who attends a lot of these things has some willingness to engage on sort of topics of gender equity. And so I was, you know, curious about how much data you got about, I guess you don't know, right, who the characteristics of those who come at all versus, but you maybe have some like on the intensive margin of like how much they attend.
So we do have data on that. So there's about, I think about 10% of those we invited have never showed up, and then showed zero interest, but we still included them in the follow-up sample. And then there's some variation on the intensive margin as well. But that's something we could do, but we haven't, to look at kind of what baseline predictors might be correlated with attendance.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with something. I didn't want to like filibuster the space in case other people wanted, but I think the combination of the fact that you think that like the natal environment, or we know that the natal environment matters, and also that you said that these things are kind of hard to change and people settle into patterns, suggests that like maybe, more intervention like before people choose their partners could be really, I remember going to a panel, it was at Harvard once on, or I think I was in the panel actually, on like just like it was women in the health workforce, but like we ended up talking about a bunch of different things, and there was this really magnetic speaker, and one thing she said is that like the most important thing for women in terms of like succeeding in their career is finding a partner who like has the same perspective on equity and the same. And so for some reason that came back to me when you were talking. And so like maybe it's more about educating girls ahead of time about the consequences of their choice for partners. If you're what you're kind of, because what you were getting at is that like people do settle into patterns and it's hard to change, and that also to some extent like you come into the relationship with experiences of violence that you might continue to act out.
Or even like coaching on how to have that conversation, like, some sort of sense that that's a conversation worth having, but also if it's not talked about very much openly in society, like practice having conversation about this topic. Yeah.
I mean, one project I would love to see would be kind of a similar intervention for kind of like newlyweds or even engaged couples, because I mean, even most of the youth is more like, let's just go find a bunch of youth and their kind of peers and their friends, and they're going to, talk about these issues together. They're not established couples. So it just seems like looking at the moment where the couple kind of is close to being established, at least, so it's like serious and kind of ready to engage with these questions, but still kind of there aren't established patterns, seems like potentially a really pivotal moment.
And that's my memory of some of the like sort of attempts to change gender norms too, is that it's sort of a lot easier to do for younger people than older. So anyways, this is very, very interesting, super terrific, very comprehensive talk. I also learned a lot, and I appreciate you taking the time, and can't wait to hear about what you do next.
Thank you so much for coming and for the chat, everyone. This is great. And yeah, any follow-up questions, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'd love to discuss.
Thanks again. Thanks everyone for joining.
Have a
Good
good
to see you.
afternoon. Bye.
Bye.